Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm very excited to be part of this event and jointly hosted by E3G and CGD. As it's well timed that we're going to be talking today about resilience because of recent events have clearly shown the importance of broader resilience is an imperative to understand. Over the last 2 years, the world has not only faced increasing challenges associated with a changing climate, but it has been already compounded by a pandemic and a major war involving a G20 country. It is fair to say that at the start of the year, it seemed far-fetched that European countries could realistically face an energy crisis within 12 months, let alone that this could reverberate across the globe. I believe if we can draw any lessons for policymakers from the last 2 years, it is that understanding resilience in all its forms is key to securing and protecting development gains, and that the global economy is unprepared to deal with more frequent exogenous shocks. So the hope of a wider recovery, something that seems like it seems something that was widely discussed last year, and however uneven it is right now, still is in peril. This is without accounting for the likelihood of climate disaster and their wide-ranging implications for security, stability, and social cohesion. The ability to support countries that, through no fault of their own, face increasing risk of climate disasters and which are vulnerable despite their middle-income status based on their GDP levels, will be important in ensuring that development gains are secure and the developed countries have markets to trade with. This is a reminder that countries are all part of the wider economic ecosystem. So basically, the idea of this proposal of a resilience and sustainability trust fund by the IMF was welcomed by many, and that's why we're here today. It is welcome that the IMF has put this together in record time relative to their own track record, at least. However, as many of our colleagues and other think tanks and CSO have seen, the latest documents on the design of the RST leave too many questions unanswered. But to clarify, today the aim of this event is to discuss what should the IMF mean by resilience, what implications this has for maximizing the support being provided to countries. We're not here to discuss the exact conditions around the Resilience Sustainability Trust Fund, as it has been widely discussed in other firms, and I'm sure given that the latest documents from the board, there will be more discussion in the coming weeks. In my view, there has been less attention paid to clarifying, getting a better understanding of what the R stands for on the Resilience Sustainability Trust Fund. And this is what the event is about. We're hoping to do that today by achieving a better understanding of what resilience means that could potentially inform what kind of support the institution should be able to provide to countries if it's indeed committed to increasing resilience. This new trust has the benefit of being able to leverage the rich knowledge that has already been and is being developed in this space. And this is where our panelists are well equipped to help answer some of the quick questions. So I will introduce our panelists in a brief moment, but I would like to ask our panelists to bear in mind these points. What macroeconomic resilience means, how this can be measured, what actions do countries need to take to get there? More importantly, what external financing might be needed? And what are the systematic vulnerabilities that economies might be facing? And because we're talking about the IMF, then how this institution could be supporting countries to build more resilient economies. To address these points, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I will keep this introduction brief, as our speakers need no introduction. So with us today, there are going to be 4 panelists, and I will have also 2 colleagues, Mark Plant from CGD, moderating the event, and Taylor Dimsdale from E3G, who is going to help us to close the event. But going back to our panelists, so we have Dr. Mahmoud Mohouddin, Executive Director, International Monetary Fund, and recently appointed as the UN Climate Change High-Level Champion for Egypt. He has been the United Nations Special Envoy on financing the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda since February 2020. He was Minister of Investment of Egypt from 2004 to 2010, and most recently served as the World Bank Group Senior Vice President for the 2030 Development Agenda, United Nations Relations and Partnerships. Dr. Hanan Morsi, apologies if I mispronounced that, she's the Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief Economist at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. She has an extensive experience leading top quality economic research, policy dialogue, and development work for international financial institutions, including the IMF, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the African Development Bank, as well as the private sector. Dr. Nicoletta Battini, she's an experienced macroeconomist and currently works in the IMF's Independent Valuation Office. She's a scholar of innovative monetary and fiscal policy practices. She has become a leading expert in the design of macroeconomic strategies to deal with the climate change and public health nexus, focusing on land use and food systems. But she was also an advisor of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. And last but not least important is Dr. Stefan Hallegatte, Senior Climate Change Advisor at the World Bank. He joined the World Bank in 2012 after 10 years of academic research in environmental, economic, climate science in different universities. His research interests include the economics of natural disasters and risk management, climate change adaptation, urban policy and economics, climate change mitigation, and green growth. He was also the lead author of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. So we'll stop there. So welcome to our panelists. And now I will hand over to Mark Plant, who's going to be moderating the discussion. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Delaney. It's a pleasure to co-host this discussion with my E3G colleagues and to welcome the distinguished set of panelists to talk about resilience. Resilience seems to be one of those words that everyone uses, but when pressed, it turns out to be a bit hard to define. It has many aspects, but one thing is clear, that when shocks occur, we want enough flexibility to adjust, but not so much that the shock and the adjustment break the system. And I think COVID has amply demonstrated the lack of global resilience of even national resilience that we have now. The IMF has been quite courageous in putting forward the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, the RST. It's very much stepping out of its usual bounds to address a new concept, but I think it's a concept that will define economic affairs in the 21st century, much as balance of payment sustainability defined the 20th century economic discussion during and after the Bretton Woods Conference. Much as the mid-20th century world had to learn to deal with an interconnected global financial system and trade system, we now have to learn how to make that system work in the face of shocks that reach beyond the traditional bounds of what we've known in the past and of what we've been comfortable with. So it's very much, we're pushing the envelope here, and the IMF is to be applauded for being front and center in that discussion. But the first step is to figure out what we mean by this new kind of resilience. Let me not take up any more time, and let's hear from our panelists, the true experts on this. But let me give you a reminder up front that you, the audience, can send us your questions through YouTube. There's a question button on YouTube, or via Twitter at CGDev or #CGD Talks. And by email, you can use the email events@cgdev.org. So with that introduction, let me turn to our speakers. Mahmoud, let me turn the floor over to you, please.
Right. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to join this very distinguished panel to discuss one of the best outcomes of the spring meetings. Could be very few of what can be considered as positive outcomes. If it is only one, it could be this RST, the establishment and the announcement of the resilience and the sustainability trust fund. And let me just give you a bit of a background and try to answer your very tough question on what is really meant by resilience in practice. The existence of the RST has really a very short history behind it. And I agree very much that the IMF as an institution acted fast, which is really to be commended. And I'm happy to say that the RST had been very much demand-driven. By that, I mean that it was very much as a good, adequate response by the IMF, very eloquent, skillful staff and the management to endorse the idea that the IMF should have in its toolkit a fund that should really deal with the COVID-19 crisis and its impact. And when I say it's demand-driven, I'm saying that for three reasons. One, and it has something to do with a group of the representatives of developing economies and emerging markets, that realizing that vulnerability is not just limited to low-income countries, and indeed, it impacts small islands, including middle and high-income small islands. It impacts the rest of the developing economic communities, including the middle-income countries. So the idea there is, how can we really do something to help vulnerable economies beyond the category of low-income countries? And that was the initial proposal. I would say that this has benefited from two important developments in the development finance sphere. One is the Finance for Development initiative of the UN, led by the Secretary General and the Prime Ministers of Canada and Jamaica. And that involved the membership of the UN. And it emphasized the importance of vulnerability rather than confining the tools and instruments to a category of low-income countries. The second was basically the reactions of the European Union on their recovery and resilience facility. Of course, the figure there is much bigger than what we're talking about in the case of the RST. But it's the same kind of philosophy and spirit behind it, is to help countries through some sort of collective action and cooperative spirit to support them in dealing with huge external shock. So we had the motivation coming from that track on the UN, but we had the practice coming from the UN. I say, well, how the IMF can really be doing something useful there. And as we know, there is the PRGT, the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust Fund in existence, which is only dedicating its work to the low-income country group. The good thing is that our very skillful staff managed to get their act together, and built on the experience of the PRGT that has many years now in existence. And the model of operation is more flexible, I would say, with better terms in terms of concessionality, if you consider the grace period. And if you consider as well that an instrument as simple and as flexible as the PCI, the policy coordination instrument, could be the only requirement for having the access to that fund. It's not just the demand that creates matters. You need as well to check the supply of funds and what could be the interest of those who are going to be donating their funds. And that, as you know, coincided with the issuance of the SDRs and issues related to possible reallocations of the special drawing rights had been in mind there. And we found that the RST could be one of the vehicles to do that, in addition to the PRGT, in addition to a variety of bilateral arrangements or through the accredited MDBs to use the SDRs. But definitely, as it had been seen, and I'm happy that more than a dozen of countries had pledged and committed to supporting the RST through their SDRs or other means of funding from their national purse. But the supply side, the original idea is to have a broader framework and objectives. While the RST is still insisting it's a multi-objective kind of a fund, but I think a good number of the suppliers of funding and the donors are taking climate. And so this is more on the sustainability side as the main motivation for them to participate. So I'm happy. Well, at the end of the day, we have now a ready to go and functioning fund with adequate resources. We hope to have more. I think some people, it's not official yet, so don't quote me on that. But I think the funds could be as close as 30 plus billion or 40. But I may need to have more accurate data, because we don't really count the pledges. We need just to see how much is really in the account. Here, I think we have the good toolkit with good resources. It could be operational within a few months. And with my climate change hat, I'm happy to have the climate as one of the areas of motivation. On the resilience point, and very quickly, it's basically about enabling countries to bounce back in a good way. And I think Professor Brunmeier is in his excellent recent book about the resilient society has a nice definition about bouncing back. And we have, after a shock, one of two possibilities: that countries in the midterm, long term, could really go beyond the trajectory of their long-term growth after a shock, or go lower below that trajectory. And if this fund could really help through the support on the macroeconomic conditions, because yes, the motivation and the driving factor here could be sustainability, but it is coming from the IMF, so it needs really to test the macro critical issues related to macro stability, issues related to the resilience against shocks from the balance of payment side, the fiscal discipline, the monetary and the financial sector. So all of that, really, I would really say that the resilience comes from the traditional work or the conventional work on the IMF. Mentioning Professor Brunmeier, and very quickly, he puts two good examples comparing Thailand to India after the Asian flu in 1997, 1998, and how Thailand managed to do better than India because of the flexibility of the system and the ability for its inclusive growth to be back on track, while India then didn't really do it. And there are many good examples here about how to build this kind of resilience to the economy. And the other case he put from Japan after its banking crisis in the 1990s, and Japan after the tsunami in 2011. And it did better after the tsunami than it did after the banking crisis in the 1990s in relative terms. And here it has something to do with regulatory environment, the macroeconomic conditions, and the ability for the political economy dynamics really to support the recovery. I would really say for this Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund, to have the balanced approach, because you cannot really be sustainable without being resilient. So issues related to the fundamentals and the ability to go back on track to the midterm, long-term growth trajectory is essential. The second part really is basically, even when we are dealing with sustainability, we need really to have a broader perspective than a reductionist approach for sustainability to mean only climate change, and for climate change to mean only mitigation, and mitigation to mean only carbon and carbon pricing. But if you take sustainability from a broader perspective, it would really link itself nicely to the resilience of the economy, and more importantly, the resilience of the society at large. Back to you, Mark.
Great. Thank you, Mahmoud. Let's turn next to Hanan. Hanan, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just say that there are many of Dr. Muhyiddin comments I agree with. Let me just perhaps define from my perspective, how do I see the R? So the R, to me, is two components. One is the ability of the economy to withstand exogenous shocks that are mostly unexpected, and two, the ability to recover once you're hit with that shock and the speed of that recovery. Of course, part of it is, some of these external shocks lead to long-term GDP losses and deviations from long-term growth. So what you want to see is basically minimizing these long-term losses. And we've seen that in, the global financial crisis and what it meant in terms of long-term GDP losses, and in, other earlier crises. So basically what you want to see is the ability of the economy to weather shocks with some flexibility, and then to minimize the long-term impact of these shocks. Let me perhaps take the discussion a little bit closer to what I focus on, which is Africa. For Africa, the exposure to external shocks over the last few decades have increased substantially. And it comes from multiple sources. We've seen it in terms of impact of commodity price cycles on this economies, but we've also entered the impact of the pandemic with the global tightening of monetary conditions. And now we see it with the war in Ukraine and implications in terms. So the countries in the continent have been increasingly exposed to these shocks, as well as to increasing exposure to climate-related shocks and extreme weather shocks. This, at the same time, while Africa has been the most vulnerable and least equipped region, its 1.2 billion population suffered the most from global warming, while contributing the least to it. Africa has been warming at faster rate than elsewhere, and as I mentioned, increasingly exposed to these extreme weather shocks. It's estimated that the cost of these climate risks are expected to be around $50 billion, and to cost around 7% of annual GDP. And not only this, but also this is closely related to issues of agriculture, the climate change issues, which is particularly important to Africa, given the very high dependence on that sector. It represents almost 70% of a source of 70% of employment. So it has significant implication, and the increase in extreme weather shocks to that sector really have serious risks, including food security risks to the continent. So all these issues really point to the importance of number of structural issues. So exposure, the vulnerability and exposure of the continent to climate change, even though the continent itself contributes the least to it. The interlinkages with issues of food security and the implication of it, because we have, just during the pandemic, those that are at risk of hunger increased by 46 million just during the pandemic. So with the current crisis due to the war in Ukraine, this is even putting further pressures. And all this means that there are serious structural issues that basically will need to be tackled. And the RST represents a useful tool to actually address these issues. And here I'd like to highlight two elements that I think are very important in the RST and how it relates to these structural issues. One is the issue that it's a longer term tool than what we're used to from most of IMF tools. The fact that the maturity of this resilience and sustainability programs will be longer, so it gives longer time to actually adjust and address these structural issues, which is very important. And the second is the hope that this type of financing can leverage substantial additional funds. Climate financing, can attract further climate financing and can leverage other sources of whether private or public sources of financing. So these will be kind of the two elements that would really be very important to ensure that they are used in a way to actually help these countries address the long-term challenges. Maybe just one last issue that I wanted to highlight is in the current structure, yes, there is a high emphasis on the climate change, but I think there is a need to really look at broader, in terms of a broader definition of structural issues that would lead to or affect resilience. And I think there is a need to really highlight and emphasize issues of food security, given all what we are seeing now with the current crisis, more than the current document actually does. I'll stop here and happy to come later. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. I'm sorry we lost your video, but I guess your signal was weak, but we heard your message loud and clear, so we appreciate that very much. Let me turn now to Nicoletta.
Thanks, Mark. I would like to take maybe not a different angle, but explore a bit what you said at the beginning in your opening remarks. In the context of their discussion of the fund staff proposal to establish resilience and sustainability trust in July 2021, the executive directors of the IMF board concurred that the envisaged role of the trust was to provide affordable long-term financing to enhance economic resilience and sustainability, which would contribute to prospective balance of payment stability that is in turn consistent with the fund's purposes. Now, most directors supported RST operations to focus initially on addressing climate change and pandemic preparedness while maintaining flexibility to add additional perhaps challenges in the future. And there was quite a lot of consensus about this. Although some directors proposed, expanding immediately the number of challenges so that there be more flexibility in application. Now, having said this, I think the first thing to say is that resilience, so your question for this panel, resilience here relates quite clearly to the ability to maintain a certain level of economic performance amidst shocks. So to continue to perform economically amidst shocks, which goes back to my previous panelist's remarks. It does not mean attaining a physical or structural resilience to shocks themselves. And similarly, sustainability, as was said before, refers to debt sustainability and ultimately balance of payment stability, which are quintessentially economic fundamentals. And it does not refer to sustainable growth, as in nature positive growth or growth not conducive to more frequent pandemic events. I think it's important to make this distinction. On the face of it, this interpretation does makes obvious sense from the point of view of the IMF, which is de facto the world's custodian of global financial stability. The fund needs to worry primarily about the economic side of things. The interpretation, however, sparks a second reflection, and namely that it's unclear how a country, in fact, can build economic resilience and remain fiscally sustainable in a world of continuous and ever larger physical crisis, like those posed by the documented planetary climate trends or other trends observed in the past half a century in, for example, emergent zoonotic diseases. I'm not sure about SARS-CoV-2 because it seems now there's overwhelming evidence it's a man-made virus. We have seen small and larger countries devastated by the rage of erratic climatic events. Think about Puerto Rico 2017 after Hurricane Maria, with damages amounting to virtually all of its national income in 1 year. Or Vanuatu in 2015 after Cyclone Pam, one of the most powerful cyclones ever recorded in the Pacific, which caused immense destruction, totaling at least 60% of the country's gross domestic product. Or again, the 10-year-long mega drought vexing California. This is not just a small island, low-income country problem, a state which accounts for 15% of US total GDP, and which provides 2/3 of the US fruits and nuts, over 1/3 of its vegetables, 80% of the world's almonds, and is the world's 4th largest wine producer. And likewise, let's think of the COVID-19 pandemic. Its shock triggered the deepest global recession since World War II and was about 3 times as bad as the global financial crisis of 2008, causing per capita output to contract in a record high number of countries. And in contrast with the global financial crisis, in this time, both advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies face heavy losses. It was also, attention here, an unprecedented shock in nature because it was not unleashed by the health impact of the virus, which was actually minimal, exposed in numbers and direct expenditure. It reflected the economic impact of government's own actions to reduce the spread of the virus, in the belief that these non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdowns that's much talked about, could actually reduce fatality rates and reduce the severity of the pandemic. So the question here is, how do we push back financially events which are non-stationary and heteroscedastic, in other words, events which increase in number and volatility over time, and events which are systemic at a global level? So climate shocks are hard, massive supply shocks which lead to prolonged period of low or negative growth and high inflation. Demand policies from government, like the ones used today, are only palliative. And in the end, they deliver double-digit inflation, which backfires, especially on the most vulnerable countries and people, which are the ones that we are talking about right now. So I would argue that there is a strict connection here to be explored. I'm talking about the endogeneity of public policies to physically and structurally mitigate climatic and other risks and the economic repercussions of those risks. Do we want a trust which concentrates its lending on adapting economies to events that we treat as exogenous acts of God? Or do we want a trust which lends money conditional reforms that correct and potentially remove the anthropogenic component behind these events? Now, traditionally, the fund strategic direction of financing, in these cases, has been directed at what I call defensive economic adaptation, That is, take climate shocks happen. You have to stack up buffers. You have to develop policy toolkits. You have to enhance system flexibility to ensure that shock adjustment works primarily through prices rather than quantities. And this is the meaning, I think, now of resilience by the fund with this trust. And these meta goals are then declined in a number of economic reforms that are supposed to buttress macroeconomic and financial stability during turbulent times. I think, and I conclude here, that we have entered a space in which this tactic needs to be complemented or overlapped or even substituted to country level and international policies to mitigate rather than adapt economic policies. And here I need to open a parenthesis before I conclude. It is often said, and it's true, of course, that low-income countries, to which the trust is mostly directed, and lower middle-income countries produce little emissions, and they're not responsible for the vast share of the planetary situation in which we verse. However, we do know now that these countries, we know better at least, that these countries can contribute enormously to ecosystem preservation, which we know also is one of the key planetary defense mechanisms against climate change disruption originating in human activity. So, for example, it's been studied that around small islands, if you operate marine protection areas, you actually become much more resilient physically to adverse climatic events, including acidification and lack of depletion of fish stocks and other events like tsunamis and so forth. So I think we should explore the connection between the role of human activities and public policy, and that ideally should be embedded and tucked in the concept of resilience used here. I pass it back to you, Mark.
Thank you, Nicoletta, and thank you for pushing us actually in an interesting direction. Let me turn the floor over to Stefan now. Stefan?
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation. And I think I'll join everybody in finding that it's a great news to see this new instrument being put forward. I think anybody working on this topic knows that we need to do more to make those issues around resilience and sustainability at the core of economic and development policies. We also know that there is no one tool that will fix everything. So we really have to look at this toolbox, and I think adding one big tool in the toolbox is always a good news. Another point I wanted to start from is the fact that if I look at the work we've been doing at the World Bank Group in the last years, I think it's really important to see these new instruments also as opportunities to learn and to acknowledge that probably things will be adjusted over time as we learn about what works and what doesn't work. So not trying to get everything right at the first step, because we will learn and we will have to adjust. What I wanted to stress here are just a couple of things. One is, if I look at again the experience at the World Bank and the move with climate and resilience taking a bigger share of our activities, we wanted to make it very clear that this is not about bringing a new objective or a new mandate. We're not looking at resilience or climate change because of resilience or climate change. It's only a means to achieve our mandates and our goals, which haven't changed. We're still promoting development, still promoting poverty reduction, and we're looking at resilience and climate change because we feel that we need to do that to achieve our mandate and our goals. And I think this is very similar in the case of the RST, that the objective is really not to just add a new objective, but just to recognize the fact that we're going from crisis to crisis, and that financial stability, economic growth, development, poverty reduction is more and more dependent on our ability to prevent and to manage those crises. But it's clearly not a new mandate. So in the end, it's very much about good development and good economic policy. And I think that's a point that we want to make very, very strongly, because some people are suggesting that we're shifting away from our historical mandate and objective, and I think this is really wrong. We're keeping those objectives unchanged, but just finding new ways of achieving them. So what we can hope is that those tools focusing on sustainability and resilience will also be good economic policy. We have a lot of evidence that investments in those sectors are good investments. We've looked at the resilience of infrastructure, finding that $1 invested in there brings back $4 in avoided losses. We found that inclusive development can divide by 2 the number of people falling in poverty because of climate change. So I think this is really what we should be starting from. Now focusing on the resilience part of the discussion. I mean, first we have to recognize that there are like probably as many definitions of resilience as people working on the field. I think that's okay. There are a lot of, I mean, we can spend hours talking about the details, but I think we see what is the big picture here. At the World Bank, we have been using this very traditional framing where we really start from the shocks that affect our economies. We look at who is affected, so the exposure in terms of economic sectors, in terms of assets, in terms of population. Then what we label the vulnerability, which is the impact on the income of the population affected, and socioeconomic resilience, which we have defined as the ability of the economy to cope with and recover from the shocks. But I think if you look at the whole picture, this full causal chain, it really starts from shocks which very often are in the physical world, from a pandemic to a hurricane and an earthquake, or like a commodity price shock, and it ends with well-being and welfare of the population. And really, we need to look at this as this full chain, and you can see that the kind of like policy instruments that will be mobilized and that the RST, I think, is supposed to promote, will be covering a lot of different sectors and a lot of different aspects. And I just wanted to stress 2 things. First, so the IMF and it being focusing on the macro aspects and economic and financial stability, there will be a need to work a lot with the people working on the different sectors. So bringing much more like the people working on the energy sector and its resilience, on water management. Nicoletta mentioned the ecosystems. So it's one of the challenge is really to use this macroeconomic entry points that the IMF will have to better connect with what people are doing in many different sectors. And I think it is really a chance to improve this connection. And I hope the collaboration between the IMF and the World Bank Group can really help do that. We have a lot of work at the sectoral level, which we will be very happy, of course, to help connect with this initiative. The other dimension is not only about engineering and the sectors, it's also about the social dimension. And what I wanted to stress is if you look only at the macro and you look, for instance, at GDP or aggregate income, you're missing a lot of what's happening for the poorest in your populations. I mean, in many countries, poor people are so poor, whatever happens to them won't change your GDP, right? So one of the things that we have really pushed at the World Bank recently is this idea that we have to go beyond aggregate losses, beyond asset losses, to look at the impact on income, consumption, and well-being and welfare, taking into account that losing $1,000 in consumption is nothing to Bill Gates. It's an inconvenience to me, but it's something that for especially like children in low-income country can be the difference between staying in school or not staying in school. So affecting a lifelong prospect. To capture those effects, you really have to go beyond the macro. You really have to go up to what's happening to households. So the connection with what we're doing on social systems, social protection, market insurance, and so on is really important. So another challenge here to me it would be to connect this economic stability, economic growth framing of resilience to what's happening to families and people at this level of granularity. We have been working in the Philippines, for instance, on priorities in terms of risk management. And it's really interesting because the priority area where you want to work on is completely different depending on how you define risk and how you define resilience. If you define risk in aggregate terms, asset losses or economic losses, you will invest mostly around the capital city, Manila, because this is where all of the assets and economic activities are. If you just define risk as, I want to reduce the impact on poverty of disasters in my country, then you have other regions, especially the Eastern Shore, that becomes your priority. So our point is, defining your priorities will depend on your policy goals. So you have to have an engagement at policy level. It's not only an expert and an economic discussion, it's a political discussion. And we really have to look at the impact on people at the level of the families to do the right thing. Last point, especially if you look at the people angle, speed is everything. So too often we're implementing great response to disasters, except it's like 6 months after the fact. And 6 months after the fact, some of the effect on health, education, it's just too late to avoid them. So one of the big questions is how do we connect with this question of contingent financing? How do we make resources available immediately to a country when affected by a shock so that people can get helped very, very quickly? And there is a financing challenge and there is a delivery challenge. How do we really provide help to people on the ground? So I want to stop here, but basically I think on the definition of resilience, to me, what's really important is to make sure it's not only about the macroeconomy, but it's also well connected with the engineering and what's happening in the sectors, but also not only aggregate, but also disaggregated at the household level and at the firm level and the family level, so that we take into account these social priorities and we really engage with the delivery mechanism, how those action on resilience will help people on the ground when they are affected by a shock. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Stefan. Before we go on to our conversation, let me remind the audience that you can send us your questions through YouTube or on Twitter. And Twitter, you use @CGDev or hashtag CGDTalks, and by email at events@cgdev.org. And as we wait your questions, I have some certainly. I think the one theme I heard is there are various aspects of resilience that are interconnected, but in some sense, but people want to separate. So you have the notion of financial resilience or macroeconomic resilience, if you will. You have the notion of structural resilience, engineering resilience, physical protection, and then you have this notion of social resilience as well, that the society can withstand impacts. And I think the question is, to what extent can these be separated or integrated, and how does the IMF work to ensure that its focus on macroeconomic resilience doesn't ignore the other aspects? Mahmoud, maybe I'll ask you, you've done a lot of work on the social aspects of the SDGs and so forth. How do you see the macroeconomic resilience connecting to the social resilience, and what are the feedback loops?
Right. The way I see this this fund, given its magnitude and still it's very much in the infant days, I would say it's going to be getting the IMF more aligned with the sustainability and resilience discussions and debate at the global level, and more importantly, better engagement at the country level. Yes, the eligible countries could be more than 140, but the amount of money that could be allocated is very small at the end. We're talking about 50% of quota or a maximum of 1 billion. So I think the main role here, in addition to the funding requirements and hopefully dissemination, will be fast, as mentioned by Stefan earlier. But it's this kind of engagement of the IMF in a supportive, catalytic work that may not hinder the work that is conducted by the country at its level, or through partnerships with others in other aspects of resilience, being them in nature, being them on the rest of the ecosystem, or on society. So here I think this is a very good tool for the engagement and getting the macroeconomic focus of the fund, as it should be, because you see in the documents, either the initial documents that Nicoletta mentioned or the latest document that came out after the meetings in April, all of them are saying, well, the IMF should really stay with its mandate with macro-critical approach to matters. For that, in a very narrow definition, is basically helping countries resume their long-term path of growth. That shouldn't really contradict the societal aspects of it or the social aspects of it, or taking care of the greening path that is being endorsed, because this is a part of the issue, that linking the resilience on the macro foundations with the sustainability in that kind of tool. So that stands to be tested by the countries engaging with the fund and what kind of partnerships that would be really happening. We are, simply put, we are facing a crisis in multilateralism and cooperation difficulties between different multilateral institutions. So if this new tool can enhance more collaboration between the fund with its comparative advantage, with the World Bank, with the regional development banks, with the UN system and others, that would be very much welcome in itself. And testing that all at the country level and enhancing coordination in these different aspects of resilience, that could be in a good day reaching the objectives of the resilience and recovery. I mentioned earlier the EU example. I think these are basically the points of emphasis in the EU, but for that to happen, in their case, they put huge magnitude of funds, multiples, and it's not 30 or 40 billion, it's 750 billion plus of euros. And with an ecosystem and initial conditions and political economy dynamics that are much more conducive to support these change than a typical developing economy that is suffering, in the case of what Dr. Hanan just mentioned, in the case of Africa, overwhelmed with variety of crises and suffering from the lack of the right initial conditions in many cases. Definitely, it's a helpful tool, but we shouldn't really, while we're happy to have it, I don't think it should be seen as a panacea. It's basically a simple catalytical device that should really be helpful to the IMF doing its role better and being a tool for partnership and enhance the work at the country level where it really matters.
Nicoletta, you sit inside and outside the fund in your perch from the IEO. And I think the point Mahmoud is making is that the fund is going to have to cooperate and incorporate the perspectives of other organizations. Do you see them ready to do that? You were talking about sort of, in some sense, my sense is you were pushing us to think more about the fusion rather than fissure of macroeconomic sustainability from other types. Is the fund ready to do that, or what do they need to do to do that better?
I think the fund, that's a really good question. I think the fund, and there is an evaluation, for example, of the fund collaboration with the bank, which, we've explored in more detail some of these aspects. And this also looks at issues like collaboration on climate change challenges and so forth. So the fund is becoming increasingly aware that in this new world of new shocks that are bigger, larger, more frequent, it needs to partner more. I mean, it's not just a matter of going there by yourself, but there's increasing need and benefits to fund, to the effectiveness of fund financing and to the catalytic role of the fund and to the effectiveness of fund policy advice to partner with other IFIs, RFIs. So this is actually happening. I mean, I'm not sure about the pace of it, but for example, in the pandemic, and we are examining this in an IEO evaluation now on the fund's response to emergency response to pandemic. There's been an opening of a lot of doors and a breaking of a lot of silences because the fund has found it useful to get together with others, not just at the international level like the G20 and other and major central banks and so forth, but actually really with partners on the ground. So I think there are multiple benefits of doing that for the fund, and these trusts will be clearly a case where that avenue of collaboration should be emphasized and leveraged upon. I think there's also another dimension which is very important in partnering with other international organizations and actors and stakeholders, and that is the possibility of synergies at the regional level. A lot of these phenomena, like for example, supply chains, we took the food supply chains, which I'm knowledgeable about. They operate now on a global scale, but you can actually shorten the supply chain and make it from global to regional. And you already have a significant redimensioning of some of the problems that occur, for example, during the pandemic, if you regionalize food systems. And then you can go down further to smaller sub-regions. So the fund at that point, would benefit from a strong collaboration with the regional financial institutions and other people on the ground, including CSOs, that have, incredible knowledge of the specificities of these sectors. As Stephen said, a lot of these shocks require sectoral expertise, and that's where the fund is weakest. And therefore, I certainly think, but a lot of people start thinking more and more within the fund walls, that partners are the key to success in this kind of operations.
Stefan, you're across the street and working with the fund closely, no doubt, and have again an outside-inside view of the fund. I was interested to read the recent evaluation on resilience for Grenada, I believe it was. How was the bank involved in that, and how did that cooperation work? What are the key areas that both the bank and the fund and other partners are going to have to beef up, if you will, to get this integration between financial resilience and the other kinds of resilience, so working in a synergistic way?
So I think there is already a lot going on, right? We exchange very, very frequently. If you're looking at a few of the recent reports that the IMF published, they've been using, for instance, estimates for the investment needs in various sectors, and this is very much a sector-based work. Like, you have really to look at every different sectors with your objective and how much you have to invest in that. And so they have used the work we did on investment needs, brought that into their macro level modeling. And I think this is really the direction of travel, right? That we want our information to be used as much as possible. All of that is, of course, open data for everybody to use, but our collaboration with the fund is of course a priority. We have launched recently our country climate and development reports, which is the diagnostic that we will do in all of the countries we're active in, to look at how development can be aligned with climate objectives. And we expect those reports to produce a lot of the basic information that can be used then to prioritize action for us in our macro work and all of the work we're doing at the macro level on fiscal policies and so on, but also with our partners, including the IMF. And we've put together a way of exchanging on those diagnostics, because the IMF has also the CMAP, and whether I can remember what the acronym means is not completely sure, but country macroeconomic assessment program, I think, something like climate macroeconomic assessment program. And so we're very much in touch because we see the complementarity between our work. So I think the direction of travel is relatively clear. On the point you're making about whether this can be separated, I really don't think so. Even if your mandate is really on the macroeconomic and financial stability, you cannot separate that from how whatever instrument you put in place will be used. If you have a reserve fund, you have to know how the reserve fund will be used in case of a shock. So you have to connect with the sectors. You cannot ignore risk creation. So you can't help countries manage shocks and at the same time have cities being built in floodplain, which will in parallel increase the risk this country have. So I think even with a narrow mandate, the analytics to guide action will need to be very broad. I think there is no way around that. And I fully agree when Nicoletta is saying that partnership will be a key for success. I think it's the case for everybody in that field. And if anything, what's the new direction focusing on sustainability and resilience means is that economics can be less and less separated from other disciplines and sectors, engineering, the modeling of natural worlds and climate. All of that will need much better connection. It's a challenge for all of us.
Thanks. Hanan, again, we're talking about resilience. To promote resilience, the financing of the promotion of resilience has to be resilient in of itself. How is it that we can ensure a flow of financing to Africa to meet these challenges, to build the resilience that's needed? What do you see from your perch at the Economic Commission as to how we can get those financing flows moving in a regular manner?
Yeah, I think we need to first remember that what African countries have been experiencing in terms of shocks over the last 3 years is kind of like a tsunami of exogenous shocks, from the pandemic to the implications of the rise in global inflation and tightening in financial conditions, to what we now see with the war in Ukraine. So this is really couldn't emphasize more the importance of looking at this issue of resilience and what can be done. And I believe that the move of the IMF to this tool is key. Basically is a step in the right direction because it recognizes the various type of structural issues that have very fundamental macroeconomic implications. So that's very important, and I think what I see in the RST is that it can play a key role in basically filling the Africa climate financing gap by playing a catalytic role in mobilizing other funds. So currently Africa gets only 6 billion out of 30 billion in climate finance flows globally. So, there is, however, more financing is required to actually meet the needs in the continent. With actually nationally determined contribution, it will need to be around $3 billion by 2030. So the financing needs are humongous, and this can play a role. It will be a small role, but the key is for it to be a very catalytic role by leveraging and mobilizing other sources of finance to support the continent and the countries and mitigating climate change and enhancing their toolkit. But also the other issue that this can help in as well is the issue of basically green investments in Africa and attracting, basically enabling countries to do more of this to stimulate growth and jobs and to actually enable and encourage more investments in these sectors. On the other side of the pandemic preparedness, I think we've all talked about and saw the issue and the implication of lack of vaccine and issues of vaccine inequity and what it means in terms of macroeconomic recovery and resilience. So actually enabling these countries to be better prepared for any future pandemics will be very important. And we've seen actually very welcome moves by number of African countries to actually enhance the production and distribution capacity of vaccines and in about 5 to 6 countries in the continent. So having more resources to actually be better prepared will be key. Strengthening the health systems. And I just want to also mention that it's not new to the IMF, the idea of working with other institutions. Having worked before at the IMF, I remember from my old days working on Pakistan and relying on the World Bank for the energy sector reforms. So it's more of, a change of sector on what this collaboration is about, or an evolution. But these type of close collaboration existed before, and there is no reason why they cannot actually continue and strengthen with the type of shocks that we are facing. So this going forward will be really important to enhance that with World Bank and other specialized institutions. And to the point that Nicoletta mentioned in terms of the supply chain, I think in the case for Africa, actually, a very promising area is the issue of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which actually could, if there is sufficient focus and investment in this, can actually help in enhancing these regional supply chains on issues that are very critical, like food security. So there are many things that can be done. We have to recognize, of course, that the sources of financing coming from the RST will be modest, but we need to really leverage its catalytic impact to get, kind of impact to scale. And I'll stop here. Thank you. Back to you, Mark.
So, interesting question from the audience. Someone saying that resilience really should be about more than just bouncing back. That resilience is a development tool. Resilience can actually be used to transform historic injustices rather. That when shocks come, the rich are protected, and the power or the loss of the shock gets transformed to the poor. What's your sense of resilience as a poverty reduction tool? Do they go together, or is there a difference between them? Is there a competition, if you will, between them? Clearly, resources are scarce, and you're going to have to make decisions. Do I invest in this or do I invest in that? Can you invest in both at the same time? Are there really those synergies out there? I'll open it up. Whoever wants to raise his or her hand. Mahmoud.
Right. In a discussion with Professor Brunmeier, I have the very same question to him in his similar work on the resilient society, and whether that resilient means going back to where we were, and which is not really, especially for developing economies, means much. We need really not to go back to the initial conditions, but basically to go beyond that into better, inclusive, enhanced recovery with sustainability in mind. And actually, he embraced more this kind of a more dynamic definition of resilience. Is not going back to where we were, but basically the ability to resume the long-term path. But that would not really happen without really careful design of policy. If we leave it to the kind of well-known dynamics, it will end up with this dangerous zone that the friend who asked the question it seemed that it's in the back of his or her mind. Yes, these crises are unfair. They affect the vulnerable and the poor disproportionately. And we have seen with the previous crises, from the global financial crisis, with the COVID-19 impact, with the impact on the poor, on the women, and in rural areas had been felt more. So in the design of the policy, that needs really to be prioritized and needs really to be reflected in the macroeconomic discussions, in the design of the fiscal policy and the redistributional measures attached to it, and the social protection measures attached to them, for that really to happen. Otherwise, it will be really as bad as being assumed that it's not going to be happening on its own.
Thanks, Mahmoud. Stefan, then Nicoletta.
Yeah, I can't agree more, and I think this is why this conversation is so important. I think whether resilience helps with poverty reduction and equality and inclusive development completely depends on how we define resilience, and depends on how we design the policies that we implement. I mean, everybody's saying, because it's obvious to anybody's eyes, that poor people are more affected by disasters. But if you look at some of the metrics we're using to prioritize action and to measure impacts, it's not what it shows. Because if you want to understand why poor people are more affected, you have to look at the fact that they don't have the tools to cope and recover. So it's not so much that the initial shock is bigger on them. It's more that when they're affected by that shock, they are left without anything to deal with it. Even their consumption basket doesn't allow them to do any adjustments because it's mostly basic needs that you cannot really go without. One thing which is really important is, and we had some very concrete examples where we want to do some disaster risk reduction interventions, and the economics, if you focus only on the losses that you can avoid, the benefits are very low, because if you target very low communities, they have very little assets, and therefore the avoided losses are very small. To look at the real benefit of those interventions, you have to take into account the fact that if you protect those populations, their assets will not stay the same. They will be able to invest more. They will be able to accumulate assets. They will be able to get richer. And so most of the benefits is not in the form of avoided losses. Most of the benefit is in the form of accelerated development and poverty reduction. And very practically speaking, the tools we have very often are missing completely those dimensions and might be leading to just the wrong investments in the wrong places. So I think the discussion on the definition sometimes might look a little bit like academic and technical, but at the end of the day, that will decide if poor people benefit from this type of instruments or not. So it's not a detail. It's really important.
Thanks. Nicoletta.
I fully agree with Stefan and what was said before. I think there's an extremely strong link between resilience and inequalities. It's a bit of a chicken and egg problem because the way we become resilient is by making people resilient, individual resilient, and that includes policies that lift people out of poverty. But it's also one of the three pillars, for example, of the way we fight climate change. There's mitigation of emissions, there's conservation of Earth system, and then there's a social kind of pillar which relates to demographic change and how people consume and behave, and take decisions, including parenthood choices during their life and how they react to other events. But let me just go back for a second to the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that over 99% of the people that were fatally struck by this disease are people that had developed a number of pathologies, a number of comorbidities, and these morbidities in large part are related to dietary factors and dietary risks. And here is one example where policies could be designed to, strengthen the health of people, right? And that's the way by which we strengthen the performance of economies. As Churchill used to say, the most important asset a country has are its own people. I think if we make people healthy individually, we have a resilient society, and therefore we have a resilient economy.
Hanan, you can't raise your hand, but I wanted to know if you wanted to respond on this particular question.
Yes, just very briefly, for me, I think resilience cannot be separated from these issues of inequities. Basically, to me, part of what constitute resilience is basically leaving no one behind within societies, because it has implications, whether it's short-term or long-term, but it does have implication and macroeconomic implications. And we've seen that there are so many examples and historical narratives that we can cite on this, but also making sure that you don't also leave countries behind. So I think one of the good things about this facility was actually enlarging, the number of countries that the tool is available to, so that, many of the middle-income countries used to be excluded, for example, in the PRGT. So having a tool that tackles the issue but focuses more on what we're trying to do, because when these tools are intended not just to help countries but to help with vulnerabilities And if these vulnerabilities, there are pockets of vulnerabilities within countries that are not just low income. I mean, in the current crisis, 2/3 of the countries that are affected by the war in Ukraine are middle income countries, according to work that we've done in the UN Global Response Group. So making sure that you're addressing actually the vulnerabilities that these tools are intended for is key. Not just focusing at country level, but focusing on the problem that you're trying to tackle and what is the best way to do that. So I just wanted to highlight this issue that we shouldn't be so bugged about, whether this is really like, we want to focus on the macro, because the whole idea of this tool is actually thinking of key factors that have macroeconomic implication. And definitely this goes in it, the issue of where are the pockets of vulnerabilities and what can be done to tackle this so that it doesn't translate into macroeconomic risks later. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks. One last question from the audience before we sum up. Are there any bodies or organizations to monitor funding given to different countries and making sure the funds are used appropriately for resilience? We've talked about the many aspects of resilience. There's going to be potentially a lot of money flowing out. How are we going to know if we're going in the right direction or not? What's going to be, who and what are going to be the criteria going forward? Any quick reactions on that? It's a difficult question. Stefan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think this is really an excellent question. And one thing I wanted to say is this resilience challenge is as much about spending better as it is about spending more. So it's not only about investing in resilience, it's also making sure all of the investments we're doing are designed in a way that will not create more risks that then we'll have to manage. We're doing a lot of things to make sure every investment is designed in the right way. We have been creating something we call the resilience rating system, which is basically a guide for project developers or investors, decision makers, listing for projects in various sectors. What do you need to do to check that your investments is resilient and that you take into account today's risks, but also tomorrow's risks? And what we hope with this tool is to apply it to our own portfolio so that we make sure what we're doing is resilient and we get the development gain that we expect from them. But also, if that could be used by others, it's basically giving a very simple tool for investors and decision makers to know when they have a project on their desk and the project is promising, 12% returns or like this and that impact on development. Can they trust this assessment? Because this assessment has been done, taken into account today's and tomorrow's climate risks. And of course, they will not go through the technical appendix of 200 pages of technical detail. So we hope to translate that into a B, a C, or A plus, that they know if they can trust it or not, and that way influence all of the investments. But I think it's a great question, because if we don't do that, there is no pot of money that will be able to correct the mistakes we'll do with the investment. So we really need to make sure we stop creating unnecessary risk to have a chance of solving this problem.
Nicoletta, then Mahmoud. Quickly, please.
Thanks, very quickly. So the fund, this is the trust is a fund facility mainly, and it has tools and ways to, even when things are basically concessional, to create some safeguards around the spending. And these safeguards are meant exactly to check that the funding reaches the target. So there are a number of ways this is done, and include, prior actions. They include, audits exposed, which deter sort of misbehavior. And so certainly the devil's in the detail, but we will see how this is developed. But it won't be money just helicoptered away. It will be carefully monitored in its application. So I don't think there's anything to worry about there.
Mahmoud.
Right. I think it starts at the beneficiaries' countries level. And here, with the focus on the transparency and the documents, and there is the role of parliaments, the role of CSOs to monitor the impact of these projects. Then, of course, there is the function of the board. And in the design of this new facility, we asked for an early review of the outcome than what was already or initially planned, because we need to monitor what is really happening, the pledges, if they are committed and submitted or not, and the impact through the beneficiaries' reaction represented by the board. And of course, as always, as in the case of the bank, there is the IEG, and the case of the fund, there is the IEO. We rely on their reports, the detailed reports, to guide the assessments from the board side, in addition to what comes from the fund itself, talking about this particular new toolkit. And this is a very relevant and important question. Starts with transparency and measuring the impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahmoud. Hanan, did you want to say anything on that question, or should we?
No, I think, thank you. I think it has been well covered. I agree with what has been.
So we're at the concluding point, and so let me turn the floor over to my colleague from E3G, Taylor Dimsdale. Taylor, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. And I won't be able to do justice to you and Delaney and your masterclass in moderating, but nevertheless, I'm really pleased to be involved in this event and here with such an impressive group of experts. It's been a real pleasure listening in for the past hour and a half or so. We're obviously, as you say, nearing the end of the discussion. So I'd just like to invite each of the speakers to conclude just in 1 or 2 minutes, leaving us with the one thing that they'd like everyone to take away from today. So it can be something to do with understanding of the concept. It can be a recommendation. It's your choice. But if you had sort of one takeaway to leave us with, what would that be? And maybe just to keep things easy, we'll go in the same order that we started. So if I can invite Mahmoud to go first, please.
Well, thank you so much. I would really start by monitoring the pledges and seeing the progress in terms of the commitment by the donors. Second, to identify the early countries that are applying for the help and support from this toolkit, and assess the impact based on the good holistic approach that this fund claims to have. That's, yes, it's starting from the response to the crisis, dealing with the challenges of resilience and sustainability, but it focuses on climate. So we need to see if this focus on climate is going to be, as promised, a good way to lead the recovery or not, and that would really help us in the early review that we need. But definitely we need more funds than the dozen interesting proposals, while we're very grateful, of course, to them and their taxpayers for doing that. But we need definitely more, because the demand is huge and growing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hanan, over to you, please.
Yes, I think this is the RST approval is a very good step in the right direction. And it will be important going forward to also encompass other structural issues that are very well related to issues of climate, such as food security issues. So making sure that structural issues that are interlinked with climate change challenges are reflected and covered within the RST, and the aim to improve resilience will be key, particularly for African countries. So that will be really important to make sure that this is not lost. And of course, the other issue is how well, probably, I think going forward, the modality of which the issue of the climate change related financing can be monitored probably is likely to be easier than other areas where it has not been tried, such as the pandemic, which will require probably even new partners to work with the IMF. So it will be important to see how this progress, how is that, the framework for monitoring and implementation of these issues are done. And most importantly to me is the issue of the catalytic role of this financing, because it's not just about the financing that is coming from the RST, but what it's allowing countries to actually unlock in terms of additional financing related to climate. So really, this will be the test. How much can it unlock in international financing, private financing, and so on will be key. And I think that will be a great test to its success. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Anand. And Nicoletta, over to you, please.
Thanks. Thanks, Taylor. So I think, as Mahmoud said, the money is not that much given the global context and possible applications. So the trick here will be to focus on strategy, the definition of resilience, on which we discussed abundantly, but it's of course the jury's still out what the fund will do about it, and the leveraging on partnerships that we also stress, which is going to be something which enables the fund to reach out and reach more deeply into problems and make the use of these funds effective at the end of the day. So I think these are the areas where we should focus now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nicoletta. And Stefan.
Thank you. I mean, very briefly, I think I would conclude with two things. First, the fact that the priorities need to be defined in a very broad way, really considering the sectoral dimensions and considering the specific vulnerabilities of poverty and people living in poverty. And since we're talking about partnership, I think we have a lot of work on that we would be, of course, very happy to discuss further. And the last point is acknowledging that nothing can be right as soon as it's implemented. The need for a robust monitoring and evaluation of what the program is delivering, a set of clear indicators for what we call success, and an openness to revise some of the rules and priorities when we see what works and what doesn't work. But at the end of the day, the big criteria would be to do more than just investing these resources into resilience, but being able to influence the largest development path of countries, making sure it helps with all of the investment, domestic, international, public, and private, to make those investments more resilient. Because otherwise, the pot of money is always too small to make a difference if you don't have a transformational impact on all of the other investments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And yeah, I think we need to move to a point where all investments and all support is resilient to a wide range of scenarios. So really helpful point there. Obviously, in our last minute and a half or so, I can't summarize comprehensively such a rich discussion that we've had, but maybe just two very quick reflections from my end. So, I mean, first is I think it's clear that, resilience has sort of gone mainstream, perhaps in a way that wasn't the case 5 or certainly 10 years ago. I think that's because of the urgency, prompted by just the volume, frequency of shocks we've seen across the world. We've heard today that there are different ideas of precisely what it means, or maybe it means different things in different contexts, but it does mean something. And one of the reasons to get serious about resilience is that it allows you, I think, to deliver a whole range of other outcomes, including growth and development, poverty reduction, et cetera. And it certainly means something for the communities and the countries that are most vulnerable to some of those shocks we've been talking about today. But it also means something to international institutions and to governments and to institutions like the IMF. And I think fully take the point that we need to be aware of and understand the remit of these institutions. But on the other hand, increasingly, I don't think it would be possible for many of them to deliver on their mandates without better integrating climate and disaster risk management into the operations, and without finding ways to ensure that, the broader societal benefits of resilience are recognized in the macroeconomic context. And the second point, just very briefly, is that I think we need to approach it systemically. These shocks don't operate in silos. They don't confine themselves to individual communities or to countries. They cascade across societies, so our response needs to account for that. So we need technical fixes, but we also need new approaches to finance, to policy implementation, and to governments. So none of that is an easy task. It's not something we've had to do historically, but I think it's possible. We need the right incentives and some innovative approaches and some reforms. But today has certainly given me more confidence that the right set of actors are serious and are mobilizing. So with that, I'd just like to give a very sincere thanks to all of our fantastic speakers today. And many thanks to Delaney and Mark, everyone involved in organizing the event, Bernat and the production team, and our partners at CGD, And of course, to everyone who's been listening in and to all of the great questions you've submitted. So we're planning to do more of these events. There's certainly more to talk about. So please keep an eye out for those. And with that, I'll just wish everyone a relaxing weekend and hope to see you all again very soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.